grab your popcorn and snacks, find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're doing a rare Sunday show today. I'm glad it's really exciting to be here on a Sunday. Trying to push my buttons here. Don't you hate when you have too many buttons? Anyway, my name is Charlotte, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour. And I have a great guest today, and it's a topic that interests me a lot. Serial killers of the ancient world. And I know there's a lot of those out there, and I have a couple in my mind. And anyway, I'm the owner of the California Haunts. Wow, must be Sunday. California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento. We're 35 strong up and down the state of California, Washington, Oregon, and Nevada, and parts of Hawaii. Okay, you can reach us at www.californiahaunts.org, and our radio website is www.californiahaunts.com. Talk about confusion. Anyway, I'm glad to be here today, and like I said, we have a great guest, and I'm really excited to talk with this lady because I heard her on another program, and I was really interested in what she has had to say. And hello, Stephanie Page Belson in our chat room. So without further ado, let me bring Dr. Debbie Felton on. Good morning.
Hi. Thanks for having me, Charlotte.
I'm excited to have you on. Tell us about you.
About me? Well, like you said, I'm a professor. I'm Dr. Felton. Meaning I have a PhD, not a medical degree. So I teach at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Sorry, I'm looking at a reverse image of myself here. It's confusing. Anyway, so I teach at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and my specialty is folklore in the ancient world, and especially folklore of the supernatural and the eerie. And so a lot of the stories I look at have to do with ghosts and monsters, but also serial killers in the ancient world. I'm from California originally, which is why I was kind of excited to be coming on your show, California Haunts, although I'm from the southern part, Los Angeles. So not up in, what'd you say, Sacramento?
Sacramento, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I was just thinking this morning, you know, my computer crashed twice this morning, and I thought, you know, wouldn't it be cool as humans? We wake up in the morning, we're not feeling so good, or something goes wrong, so we can just plop back in bed and flip a switch, and then all of a sudden we're like, woo! Everything's redone, your body feels great. Just like a computer.
Yeah. We're so reliant on them now, right?
Yes. It'd be really great if your body could do that. You know, you just wake up and boom, you're all healthy again. And
like reset.
Reset. So tell me about your book, because this is I find this book fascinating.
Well, I'm going to thank you for the shout out, and here's what it looks like. Okay, so, it is just what it sounds like. It's about serial killers in classical myth and history, and basically I just set out to investigate whether there was anything like that in the ancient world, because we tend to think of serial killers as sort of a phenomenon of modern society. Even if you go back to, say, Jack the Ripper, which is who people might think of as the earliest,
right.
There are cases, you know, long before that. You probably know, but you know, in the Middle Ages there were some cases. Pre-modern Europe, right? Same sort of idea. So I just thought, well, let's go farther back and see if we can find anything from 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. Because obviously there weren't news reports and there's no forensic evidence, but are there stories?
Well, one that comes to mind for me is Caligula.
Okay, yeah. So Caligula is a fascinating figure, but I actually don't put him down as a potential serial killer type because he was just so all around insane.
Sure.
Okay. There are a couple of things I should probably say to start with. One is that I have no background in criminology or psychology or forensic anthropology or anything along those lines. And so what I'm looking at is like the evidence from literature and a little bit from material culture where there is any. And so Caligula, just according to the sources, and we have to keep in mind that the historical sources are pretty biased. Like somebody hates him and is writing his biography, and
Right.
that's what you get is like one or two people's point of view. The poor guy can't defend himself, but it sounds like there was something seriously mentally wrong with Caligula.
He had issues, yeah.
And it wasn't just a question of having people killed or killing them or allegedly wanting to make his horse a senator.
Right.
There was just something a little more serious going on. I mean, it wasn't restricted to what we would think of as maybe serial killing. He just was. I don't want to apply labels that I'm not qualified to give.
No, that's fine.
Yeah. Across as rather psychotic in the sources. And then of course that's been filtered through, things like I, Claudius and various movies that make him out to be even more crazy than he may have been. Yeah.
What about Richard III?
Richard III is way past my time period.
Okay.
And then there is this, but to, I can still sort of address it in terms of one of the problems or challenges that I had when trying to do all of this was to sort out, well, you've got a leader who's abusing his power and is paranoid about keeping his position of power and therefore has any potential threats killed, versus someone who does resemble more like, at least our pop culture idea of a serial killer in terms of, grew up, torturing small animals or setting fires, abusing substances, and then later on just sort of follows a pattern of, has a sort of a ritual method of killing people and maybe a signature or something, something unique to how he or she does it. So Richard III seems to fall more into the, I'm going to make sure and, have everybody who could possibly be a threat to my power killed.
Right.
So it's that's not to say there isn't an element of serial killing in there. But when you've got the princes and the tower, if I'm remembering the case right, it's a different kind of serial killing than what I was looking at, I guess.
Okay. Well, let's do this then. You tell me, which one, as you were writing the book, which one stood out the most to you?
That's a good question, because there were, I think, rather than Caligula, I might say Nero. Oh, thank you. If you're looking for an emperor who sounds more like what we might think of as a serial killer, I would have to go with Nero. Again, keeping in mind that the sources are heavily biased against him. But with Nero, we get much more of the, like, he's some people have referred to him as like the Norman Bates of ancient Rome, because this guy was brought up, absent uncaring father, absent mother. When she finally came back, he was trying to get her attention, and she basically doesn't seem to have shown him any affection whatsoever. And so he was raised by people who had no business raising children, like, I don't know, a barber or a dancer, or, just various household servants. And so the way he's described, again, in these sources that we have to consider as biased, but still, this is the information we have. So, he grew up in this sort of environment that we sometimes associate with serial killers, not always, and certainly not everybody from that kind of a background turns into a serial killer, right? But then it's, the sources say, well, as he got older, he got violent. He would beat people up in the streets. He would start bar fights, crack a bench over somebody's head. He attacked women. There was definitely some descriptions of sexual perversity, like dressing up as an animal and like lunging at people's genitals, and just all kinds of weird, what we would consider oddities as he was growing up. And then, once he gets to be emperor, he is still having, like, what we sort of were talking about with Richard III was that political threats to his political power he would have knocked off and arranged to have them killed. But what the interesting thing about Nero, again, is the descriptions that we have that sound a lot more like what we might expect. And he had his wife killed. He eventually had his mother killed. He had, Emperor Claudius before him killed so that Nero could be emperor. So there's just a lot of these a lot more of the details that you might look for, I suppose, with
well, yeah, when you were talking about him going after the different things he went after, you think about these modern time guys like Dahmer, or you think of, killing animals and doing these other things that are a build up to what they were, what they would eventually become, and it sounds a lot like that.
Yeah, no, it does, and that's what was striking about Nero. So when you asked me for like an example that stood out, Nero definitely came to mind. And there's another description. It's a fictional case for law students, so it's sort of a rhetorical exercise. But the point is, here's this fake law case, and the students have to study it so that they can deal with a similar situation if it comes up. And so just because it's a fictional speech doesn't mean it's not based in a possible scenario that was familiar to people. And so in that case, in that sort of case study, a fake case study, it's really similar to what you have with Nero, which is the guy is basically a serial mutilation murderer. Like, he lies in wait for people on the roads, like highway murders.
Right.
But the case describes how he grew up getting away with all sorts of crimes, like breaking and entering and eventually rape, until he finally was old enough to go out on his own. And it also says things like, but he seemed like such a nice neighbor. And that was striking for that reason. It's like, it really just sounds so much like these
until the smell started coming from underneath the house. Yeah.
So, and they would find these mutilated bodies on the side of the road. So again, it sounds a lot like the modern highway serial killings issue. But in the case, they caught this guy, and the other thing they say is, if only we could give him multiple life sentences, but Greek law didn't allow that kind of thing. So it was really very striking. That came from, I think, the fourth century CE. So the time period I was dealing with was sort of 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, maybe at the most recent, which is why Richard III was a little bit later than what I normally.
Right.
But still, I did have to look at some of these cases, like Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy, with speaking of the bodies in the.
Well, sure, to compare, what was going on back then with what these guys did now.
Yeah,
and then Kemper's another one. I mean, he started as a kid torturing neighborhood cats and stuff, So, I mean, yeah, they all have a certain pattern. Like the FBI will say, okay, there's a certain pattern. These guys have a certain build-up pattern. Some will mutilate animals when they're kids. Like you say, they start out robbing houses, and then slowly it builds up to rape, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and there's substance abuse, like in the case of antiquity alcohol. So, there are descriptions of, gets very drunk, got very drunk sometimes. And so it was, I think that's what surprised me, was even though, the field of psychology didn't exist back then and criminology didn't, exist, people were still noting the backgrounds that led to people, being the way they were. So, like, we should have seen this coming, but he seemed so nice. When he's in public, he behaves like a perfect citizen, but in private, he clearly has these depraved appetites. I mean, they were saying that.
I can laugh now. It's not good to laugh at, but look at Ted Bundy. I mean, it's like,
oh yeah,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, and he was, he's a very unusual case in that.
Right. So how did you do this research? How much research went into this? Because you had to start somewhere.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting or maybe tough question for me in terms of how long ago I started noticing this sort of thing. Because in terms of research, I really, I teach full time as a university professor. Teach full time, have the usual committee work and advising duties and all that. So really, it would be in the summers when I would start looking into some of this. So it was over the course of several summers, but it started with just reading. I mean, because I've read a lot of, I teach mythology. I've read a lot of the ancient sources for other reasons. And then I was reading a story, and it suddenly struck me, well, this actually sounds a lot like serial killings. And I don't know if it's because I was, watching Dexter at the time or whatever, but it's suddenly, the question occurred to me of, well, do we have any evidence for serial killers in the ancient world? And again, it's not absolute evidence. It's a theory. It's speculation. But it's like, look, there are these descriptions that sound so much like some of the modern ones. But yeah, it took a lot of time. I read across a long chronological period and a bunch of different authors, historians, but also mythology. So I mean, there was a reconsideration of monsters as stories about monsters as well. Were those describing serial killers, for example? So John Douglas, who's with the FBI and wrote Mindhunter, which has also been turned into a series now. I think it's had 2 seasons so far. So one of the things that John Douglas speculated about was these stories from early modern Europe where you've got the werewolves and the vampires, so he speculated were these ways of explaining serial mutilation murders because people just didn't want to think that a fellow human being could do something so awful.
Right.
And I mean, okay, sure, there probably were, I mean, not probably, there were definitely packs of wolves, roaming the forests of Europe, and still are, and so I'm sure some of the mutilated bodies they found were actually killed by wolves. But, there are other types of mutilation and killing that clearly aren't done by animals. And so John Douglas was speculating, well, could these relate somehow to what we would consider serial mutilation murders? And so I started thinking about that for antiquity also. Are there patterns like that? And I mean, the monsters in classical myth represent so many different things, but you can speculate that some of these stories also bring in elements that we would think of as relating to serial killing. So this isn't to say that they were serial killings in antiquity, but it's sort of like the descriptions make it sound like the ancient Greeks and Romans recognized serial killing when they saw it. They just didn't have the phrase for it. Because, I mean, the phrase serial killing is still only a few decades old. It's not like Jack the Ripper was called a serial killer. That phrase didn't come up until like the 80s or something, I think, actually.
Was poison a popular way to kill people back then?
Yeah, of course, definitely. And so I think I have a whole chapter in there about poisoning. Poison is like a really sort of convenient and difficult to trace method, because back then they had no way to figure out was it poison that killed these people, and if it was, I mean, in some cases it was obvious depending on the symptoms, but who administered it, where did they get it? So it was a lot harder to pin poisoning on particular people, and then poisoning sort of fell out of popularity once people were able to trace poisons a lot more easily, starting around maybe 100 years ago or so. So yeah, you could recognize symptoms of poisoning, but telling what kind and tracing it back to whom is sometimes difficult. But yeah, so especially in ancient Rome, there are a lot of cases of what we would consider mass poisoning, but also serial poisoning. So again, a lot of the times having to do with jostling for political power. So like a woman, like her various family members, mysteriously died, her, husband, new husband, and it just sort of all seemed like all of these people died, and oh, look, her son is now in the position of power. So she was accused of poisoning a bunch of people to get her son into a position of power. And there are several cases like that. And there's also one of the few characters from classical antiquity that usually makes it into like these encyclopedias of serial killing is Lucusta of Gaul. So this woman who was such a famous poisoner, she was really an assassin for hire, right? So she really knew her poisons, and she could find things that you wouldn't be able to taste in your food and all that. So Lucusta, this very adept and eventually famous poisoner, even in her own time, supplied poisons to people like Nero and Nero's mother Agrippina, so that they could poison the Emperor Claudius. Again, according to the stories that we have, the versions of history history that we have. So Locusta is an interesting character. Do we call her a serial killer when she was an assassin for hire? It's a tough one. I mean, the reason that she's included in encyclopedias of serial killing is simply because she's one of the few recognizable people from antiquity that did that for a living, and is known to have, if not actually poisoned a lot of people herself, to have at least supplied the poison for other people. So she is an interesting character.
I was thinking about that, the TV series Spartacus.
I haven't seen that.
And the wife on there of the wannabe ruler, because he wanted to be, he was just one of these guys that owned a, sparring thing. And she would poison people that got in her way. Or she would poison people because she didn't like them. And I was just thinking, when you were talking about on the other show, when you were talking about this particular woman, I was thinking maybe it was based on that they had done their research and made her like that.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, we could probably Google it and see, did they have Locusta of Gaul in mind when they had this character on the show do that? And, if you look back, I mean, these are all old references, but if you look back at something like Robert Graves's I, Claudius, he's got Livia, the wife of the Emperor Augustus, basically killing people, many people over the course of decades to help maintain stability in the state of Rome, basically. And like on her deathbed, she's all like, "Oh, I've done bad things," but there's actually nothing in the historical sources that suggests that Livia actually killed people. Just that she had a lot of influence, but it's sort of like, well, did Robert Graves have Lucusta of Gaul partially in mind when he attributed a lot of this to Livia herself? But I actually haven't seen the show in such a long time. I don't remember if Locusta was a character in it. I should go back and check.
Actually, to be honest, her name was Lucretia in the show. So, I mean, it's real close. Real close to name. That's why I was thinking about that.
I haven't seen it in decades.
What about ancient Greece?
So for ancient Greece, the stories are a lot more from mythology than from history. And there are things like, not so much serial killing, but mass murders, like Odysseus slaying, 107 or so suitors of his wife Penelope when he finally gets home. So obviously he's positioned as the hero because they were all violating his household and trying to violate his wife and all that. But still, it's like it causes problems. I mean, the families of those young men all want revenge on Odysseus, and the goddess Athena has to step in and, like, almost literally as a dea ex machina, and put a stop to that. But there are other cases from myths of ancient Greece where you've got these young women who are supposed to be married off, but their fathers don't want them to. So the fathers pose all of these challenges for the suitors, and if the suitors don't win the foot race or solve the riddle, then they're executed. They don't just go away in disgrace. The king's like, you either do this or you forfeit your life. So there's some sort of veiled aspects of serial killing in stories like those. Clearly, the stories have other points, like you're getting rid of your neighboring threats, the powerful people in the neighboring countries who want to marry into your family, but you don't want. I mean, there's all sorts of political things involved there as well. But these stories involve, cutting off the young men's heads and putting them on pikes as warnings to other suitors. And those aren't just. It's not just unique to ancient Greece. I mean, stories like that show up in all across Eurasia from a long time ago. And then there are creatures like the Sphinx. So I was mentioning monsters before. So the Sphinx that we associate with Oedipus and the riddle of the Sphinx, well, she was associated with the murders of young men on a regular basis, and in a fairly specific region, the region around the city of Thebes. In some versions of the story, she's known to suffocate them. And there's an erotic element to a lot of it too. If you look at some of the ancient pictures of the Sphinx, she's like, it looks practically like she's having sex with the young men. So there's this kind of weirdness going on with the Sphinx, where you've got a consistent kind of victim and an erotic element and issues of power and solving riddles that are elements that you see later on in some serial killings. So this isn't to say that the ancient Greeks based the Sphinx on serial killings,
Right.
but it's just interesting to notice the elements that show up that early that we later on do find much more frequently associated with real serial killings that we know of, and some of the more, maybe, I don't know if realistic is the right word, but if you think of the story of the hero Theseus, who encountered human criminals like Procrustes. So this is another sort of a highway killer. Procrustes, can you say his name right all the time? Procrustes would lure travelers to his home. Like, there weren't like, police, there weren't hotels, like, along the deserted roads in some places, but he had this, his house was just off the side of the road there, and he would be on the lookout for, vulnerable travelers, maybe just an individual young man traveling by himself, and say, hey, I've got this house, give me a couple of drachmas and you can spend the night. And then Procrustes was famous for, having a bed that his guests had to fit in. And if they were too tall for the bed, he would saw off their limbs so that they could fit. And if they were too short, he would stretch them, like hammer out their limbs. And so Procrustes basically had a murder kit. Right. So he had he had a saw and he had a hammer and he had, he was binding them to the bed. And so you've got this, this element of the bed and, like, maybe some subtext of sexuality going on there. And you have a consistent, method of luring people in, and you have a murder kit. So, again, the elements are there, which suggests that the Greeks had a concept of serial killing, even if, again, they didn't have a specific phrase for it, and even if we don't have evidence of real life,
Right.
examples other than the few descriptions that we have that tend to characterize people as serial killers rather than saying they actually were somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer.
Right. Well, when you think about it, I just was thinking when you were talking, and you think about a person like Charles Manson, getting people to kill for him,
Yeah.
and then going back to Greek mythology, and maybe that's where they came up with the concept of Ares. Maybe whoever this person was had people killing for him.
Yeah, so like the god of war.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is it's a really interesting thing to consider because, well, first of all, Charles Manson did actually kill a couple of people himself.
Mm-hmm.
That just wasn't like in the forefront of anybody's
Right.
knowledge because the spree killings by the girls that well, there were a couple of men in there too, but yeah, Charles Manson was better known as an influencer. And as sort of a cult leader. And so then you look at a character like Ares, from Greek myth, then who was known as Mars.
Right.
By the Romans. And is he, a really abstract, does he stand for the abstract concept of war and violence? Because he is just known as bloodthirsty, and his children are Phobos and Deimos, it's like fear and terror, fear and dread, or, so the concepts associated with him are all sort of abstract. But is there also this idea that he, there were characters like that who were influencers who could get other people to kill for them, and that's different still from, say, hiring somebody like Lucusta. Mm-hmm. So what I would say about that is I think there are a lot more stories out there because it's not as if I was able to cover everything and find everything, but my guess would be that yes, there are more stories of influencers out there in classical antiquity, with Ares being sort of not just an abstract concept representing war, but also an indication that people can, get other people to do things for them, like you're saying, like Charles Manson did. Although I can't off the top of my head think of anything, really similar to Charles Manson in that respect.
Right.
But later on, I mean, again, in early European history, you've got sort of these cannibal cults like Sawney Bean.
Mm-hmm.
So he and his whole family would just go kill travelers, bring him back. That was their food. So this patriarch of that family got his family members to go out, and he probably did it himself as well. But the idea was that he was this patriarchal figure who would get, his wife and kids and cousins and whoever to go out and just become this huge cannibal clan. So that was there were a few definitely a few like that scattered out throughout history as well.
I was thinking too, when you think about, like, you were talking about heads on the pikes.
Yeah.
You wonder about those guys that gave the order, even because, I mean, people can get drunk with that kind of thing and really get into it. And so you wonder about a lot of those Roman generals, or, down along the line that love doing that stuff. Because, I mean, people can't, like I said, people get to the point where like a police officer, you get to the point, you see so much yuck out there that you get to the point where you're immune to it. So there might be a point where they're having a grand old time, like let's say a peasant spits on him or something when they're marching or whatever. And so for every peasant he wants, every town they take on, he's going to make sure they have him on pikes.
Yeah.
Because he gets off on it.
Well, and wanting to set examples, but I mean, you're bringing up a good point, which is because it's really important for us to keep in mind that we're talking about cultures where, violence was much more a part of everyday life. People fought and died in wars much closer to home in some cases. I mean, also far away, but there weren't hospitals either. People would die at home. Sometimes they would die gruesomely. Murders would happen in your village. And I mean, not that murder was rampant. I mean, the ancient Greeks in particular started making homicide laws very early, and even distinguishing levels of intent. So Greek, especially ancient Athens, they had this whole law code set up basically by the 5th century, and they kept refining it for a degree, what are the degrees of intent, and what is accidental, and this roof tile fell off a roof and killed somebody, so we're going to put the roof tile on trial so that the family can just have some closure, and the roof tile would then be punished, and the punishment would be like exile into the neighboring county, so they would just throw it over the borderline, something like that.
It's not funny, but it is in a twisted sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, the point was to recognize the harm that had been done. But yeah, so like you said, it was just a lot more common. So people, I don't want to say they got used to it necessarily, but it wasn't as most of us, I think, or so many of us, are removed from everyday gore, right? So it sounds a lot more horrific to us than maybe they would have considered it in certain circumstances back then. But again, when you've got these authors like Tacitus and Suetonius describing in really kind of horrific terms how people like Caligula and Nero handled themselves, there's a certain sensationalistic aspect to that. So it really can't have been that acceptable or normal to do a lot of the things that they did, or they wouldn't have come down, to us as notorious as they are. So apparently some of the things that Caligula and Nero did were shocking enough, even if the authors then exaggerated them. And included rumors about them. Clearly, there were some very disturbing elements to these historical figures' behavior.
But isn't that the point when somebody's in a position of authority, like they were, to keep the people in line? You're going to want stories like that spread about you, because that way the people won't be, prone to mess with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of, do you want to rule through fear, or do you want to rule by having people respect you? And so many leaders seem to choose fear instead of respect, and that's obviously still the case, today with some people that I won't get into.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's an interesting choice. Do you want to rule by fear, or do you want to rule by being an effective leader and having people respect you and agree with your policies, or just afraid that they're gonna be crushed by you, lose their jobs, be slandered, etc., lose their lives in the cases in antiquity. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing with the ancient Romans. I mean, you were damned if you did. I can't say that word. I'm sorry. Beep. Okay, you were. You were in a situation where if you did wrong, it was either you were going to end up on crucified on a cross, or you were going to end up with your head on a pike. So I mean, the
Yeah.
alternatives weren't that great.
Yeah, I mean, there was still definitely like surreptitious poisoning going on
Or
too.
a
Like, oh, look,
flogging, or whatever,
this character
whatever they can dream up to
mysteriously
torture.
died. Yeah, like you have these characters mysteriously dying in their own houses.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Often from poisoning that you've paid somebody to poison them too. So, I mean, I think, the characterization of the Roman imperial family as kind of nuts is, it's there for a reason. There was a lot of intrigue. There was a lot of jostling for power that often involved killing off your rivals and anybody who you thought might be a threat. So like Nero, for example, Nero and his mother Agrippina, they didn't just kill Claudius. They poisoned Britannicus, an adoptive son who was much more popular than Nero and might have been next in line, but they wanted to get him out of the way, so they arranged for Lucusta to poison him also. And apparently it was quite shocking. He just like started having a seizure of some sort at the dinner table, and all the guests are just like jumping up out of their seats in horror. And Nero's like calmly eating and going like, "Oh yeah, he has these seizures sometimes." And then, I think he had the body cremated very quickly so that people couldn't do any sort of an autopsy at all. Yeah, so again, not funny, but sort of funny it
is sort of funny to twist it sort of way, Just like I was just thinking too, you look at, I don't want to get in trouble with the royal family, but you look at the royal family of today and you look back at the Romans.
Yeah.
That were in power. And what's the main thing going on is they want to keep the bloodline going.
Yeah.
And so a lot of them were inbreeds. So a lot of them did have, mental issues going on because they were inbreeds. So it makes history. I wish I would have thought of that as a topic to look up myself to write a book, because I mean this is fascinating.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of inbreeding going on, obviously, like you say, with the ancient Romans too, and there are constantly conspiracy theories. I mean, I don't want to go too far in this direction, but I was just thinking of when Princess Diana was killed in the car crash, there were all these conspiracy theories about how the royal family wanted her out of the way because she was a troublemaker and she wasn't conforming to what they wanted her to do, and she was more popular than they were, and all that.
Right.
So conspiracy theories floating around. About how that happened, rather than just being a car crash from the paparazzi and everybody speeding too fast. So you still have these similar sentiments and thoughts about how these families want to hold on to power and who they want in the family to have the power. And
So what stands out to you as, like you say, poisoning is one of the main things that stands out to you from, for the serial killers. What other type of, I know we talked about, impaling heads and this. What other type of thing you think was going on that people may not realize?
Oh, you mean in terms of how serial killings were done in antiquity?
Yes.
Well, I think Procrustes was a good example. I mean, because there is this sort of theme running through a lot of the examples from antiquity that these happen by the side of the road. I mean, like on highways, because people are much more vulnerable when they're when they're outside of the cities. They're much more vulnerable, and so that sort of law that sample law case that I was telling you about, that was. A particularly good example because of the amount of detail in there about the guy's, childhood and upbringing, and how he progressed from lesser crimes to greater ones, which is actually a phrase that's actually a sentence in the story. And so he was a highway killer as well, but there's a description there of his victims begging for mercy, and how he would sort of tease them and make them think maybe maybe he would let them go if he would just rob them. But there was this stress in that story, and in like Procrustes, for example, and a few others that I could mention and might if I have time, that these these are sadistic killings, that they were supposedly highway robbers, but they weren't that interested in the money, or they would take the money, but then they would, torture their victims and chop them up and mutilate their bodies. So it wasn't just about the money. And so Procrusteus was one example, but Theseus, the hero Theseus, ran into several others along similar lines who had their own unique methods of killing people. There was a guy, Periphetes, who would kill people with his club, but it was the same sort of thing. It would be travelers passing by. And hero Heracles, too, on his travels, he would encounter these basically human criminals who had specific methods of, I'm going to make everybody who passes by my territory have a wrestling match with me, and I know I'm going to win because I'm just better at it. And so he would force people to wrestle with him, and he would, of course, kill them all until Heracles came along and beat him at it. So there are, in myth especially, a lot of these stories of human criminals who are generically called robbers, but who are clearly not just trying to rob people. They have some sadistic tendencies and power issues, like power control sorts of serial killers who want to assert their authority over other people. It's not just about the money. It's not just for profit. And it's not just for a political position. So there are quite a few of those stories floating around. So it's not just the Roman imperial family, and it's not just monsters like the Sphinx.
Right.
Human characters.
Do you think it's because people were so poor back then?
Poor?
We think of them as poor, but I mean, in their world, maybe these people were just, in their own eyes, their version of poor. You know what I mean? Because we have our version of poor where we look at how they were living and we're like, oh God,
Yeah, what would be the relation to serial killing that you're wondering about?
Yeah, because they're trying to get even with the fact that they don't have as much as everybody else. Blah blah blah.
That's an interesting question too, because the travelers wouldn't necessarily be rich themselves.
Right.
In fact, if people were traveling along the roads instead of taking a ship, it usually meant that they weren't as well off, because traveling by ship would be a lot more convenient, especially the road that Theseus was taking, for example. So you could let me see if I can sort of do this, because it's a reverse image here. But basically, you've got where Theseus was from, and then you've got I gotta go this way. Okay, and then it sort of goes, the land route goes around like that. But if you were rich enough, you could just take a ship that goes like straight up. But it cost a lot more to take the ship. So people who were traveling these land routes were generally not super rich anyway. And if it was a lone traveler walking by foot, if you weren't on horseback, that meant you also weren't as rich, which again suggests that the motive wasn't so much robbery as something more sadistic. But also a lot of these characters are kind of stand-ins for, this story is being told from the Athenian point of view, and they really hated their neighbors, the Eleusinians. So let's make the leader of the Eleusinians, one of these criminals, and paint him as as a sadistic murderer. So there was a political element in that sense, and if the story were told from the Eleusinian point of view, it would be Theseus that is the criminal, because he came along and killed our guy. So there are those sort of hidden political elements to some of those as well. But the stories focus more on the killings, which is one of the things that makes them so interesting. So there is another guy, Sinus, who, I'll just call him Sinus. So he was the one who would capture travelers and tie them to a tree, and then or two trees, and then when he would let the tree go, they'd be split in half, or maybe it would just be one tree, and then the person would be flung, into the air and onto the ground and die. And so I hope I'm not mixing up the characters here, but because there were so many of them, actually. Yeah. There were a couple, were about a dozen or more of these characters who each had their own unique method of killing travelers passing by. There was another one who would. I think this was in the Heracles story, he would bash his head against travelers' heads. So it was like, whose skull is harder, basically.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so like you're gonna headbutt somebody to death. It's just very odd. Like, how are you not gonna get there's no mention of helmets. Like, it's not like this guy had a helmet and the travelers didn't. It was just bashing his skull against somebody else's skull. So yeah, there's some really, you know, interesting elements to these stories. And then people speculate, well, was that guy just modeled after mountain goats in the region who would butt heads?
Right.
The speculation alone is kind of worth the price of admission to some of these myths. Like, where did they come from, and what observations might people have been making that led to them characterizing these people as doing these things? So it's a lot of fun.
Now, what do you think of the my opinion? When I think about going back to ancient Rome, do you think that some of that sadism that these guys had would be to to the extent of the gladiator fights where they enjoyed it? So these emperors would get these people and enjoy it so much because they just want to throw people in there and watch them deal with the lions and everything.
So I think there's a popular misconception about the nature of ancient gladiatorial shows.
Okay.
And again, that may have come through the media.
Sure.
In terms of, oh, we want to watch people killing each other. But in fact, it was probably more like, what would be a good equivalent, MMA, like it's staged.
Sure.
To a certain extent, it's staged, and you've got these popular gladiators, and they're fighting other human. A lot of the time, they're fighting other gladiators, and the gladiators themselves would be, people captured in war. So they'd be slaves, they'd be foreigners. On rare occasions, they might be criminals, but you're not. It was extremely rare, if at all, to have like an actual citizen in there. Again, unless maybe it was a criminal being punished. But they didn't usually, like, the level of gore and of killing has been greatly exaggerated. But yes, sometimes they would put them in there with wild animals. But in general, the gladiators, they would have different weapons. There were different types of gladiators that used different kinds of weapons. So like a sword or a spear or a net. And it was more often the animals that ended up dead than the gladiators. And at the same time, given who the gladiators were, when the crowd is cheering and maybe hoping that somebody will get hurt, because they are foreigners or criminals, the crowd is like, well, there's a certain sense of justice is being done by having these people in there. So there were different levels in these gladiatorial shows in terms of, it's kind of staged and we want to make sure the popular guy wins. And we don't want to see him killed. That would be really disappointing because we'd like to come and see him fight. So yeah, I think it's been filtered through too much Hollywood in terms of what was really going on with ancient gladiatorial shows there. Yeah.
Who do you think is the most prolific killer of the ancient world?
Oh my gosh, that's a really good question, because I've never thought about that before. The most prolific killer in terms of serial killing, rather than say, because you got somebody like the Emperor Tiberius, who was emperor for a really long time and got a lot of political rivals out of the way, like probably hundreds over the decades, but felt bad about it. Because he's like, I don't want to kill all of these. I want to have them all killed, but my power is in jeopardy if I don't. So in terms of a prolific serial killer, it's really hard to say, because we don't, especially in some of the mythological stories, we don't get the numbers. We don't know how many people Procrustes had already killed. We do have these examples of mass poisonings, at least according to the ancient authors like Livy. Oh, hundreds of people died of poisoning in this one conspiracy, but that's not the same as serial killing. But and then there are other really difficult to disentangle aspects, like if there were routine like if there was somebody, if there was a serial killer like Jack the Ripper who went after prostitutes, we wouldn't even know, because nobody cared what was happening to the lower classes in the slums of ancient Rome. So the sources we have are all upper class. They're all about the imperial family. And, it seems quite likely that crime rates were very high in the slums, and that there may well have been, serial killing of certain types of people, possibly even some of the aristocrats, like Nero, for example. This one of the stories describes that he would go to places and purposely, beat up people, on their way home from dinner, that sort of thing, from dinner in a tavern. So we just don't know what was going on in the less affluent areas of Rome, and the lower classes in Roman life in general, as far as homicide rates and types of homicides. So yeah, I'd be surprised if there weren't something like that, like Jack, way back then.
Now, going back to my other question about, the guys that were killing because I thought maybe there was some financial situation going on. I was thinking of people like in wagons that might have supplies that they took out so they could gather up the supplies like wheat or whatever they had.
Yeah, my guess is that there were sometimes what we would have are bands of highway robbers like working together, and they would, for the most part, just rob. So if there was a family traveling together with some horses and supplies, they could be set upon by a band of robbers. Women were told to not wear flashy jewelry, to hide it if they were traveling with it. Again, if they were taking these routes, because sometimes, if you had a lot of things to bring with you, or a big retinue, maybe you weren't going by ship. Certainly it was an issue on the roads, especially when you've got an empire as vast as the Romans and not enough army to act as a police force to monitor the areas. So highway bandits were kind of a plague in the Roman Empire. And we do have these mentions of women don't wear your jewelry, and bands of robbers working together. So it's a little different from serial killing, because they're not individuals and they're not necessarily killing the people that they're robbing. I mean, sure, they did in some instances, especially if people put up a fight. But the element of sadism, or the underlying subtext of sexual deviance, if you want to call it that, is not really present in a lot of those. Not that is present in every case of serial killing either, but the highway bandits are usually worked differently, and yes, they absolutely would attack supply wagons and take what they could get, maybe even run off the horse, take the horses too. But not necessarily leave a pile of bodies behind, because even in ancient Rome, that would still be a worse crime. Like, robbing is one thing, but homicide has a different penalty for it if you get caught.
Right. Makes you wonder, because the whole cut your ear off, because you hear about those, you do this, they're going to cut your hand off for stealing. You listen in on somebody, they're going to cut your ear off. Yeah. So it makes you wonder, when these people were caught for doing stuff like that, what the punishment was.
Yeah, and I think, that's sort of an eye for eye thing. That maybe was more in the ancient Near East than in, say, Greece and Rome. People would get thrown in jail. They definitely had jails and guards, even if they didn't have police they didn't really have, like I say, they didn't really have police forces.
Right.
But the Romans did have army troops patrolling the roads, and people could be thrown in prison. They could be put on a workforce. For example, they, depending on how bad it was, maybe the Romans would crucify them. And again, the levels of punishment for certain crimes were very different in terms of where in the ancient world you were and when. So ancient Athens had, several different homicide courts for different types of homicide, including the one I mentioned where like objects could be put on trial, and involuntary killings versus, intentionally planned killings. Whereas Rome, again, it was a little less coherent in some ways. It was a very broad empire, and kind of depended where you were and who the governor of the province was, and what they wanted to do with you, and what they thought they could get out of it too, in some cases. So there were bribes being exchanged, deals being made, whereas the ancient Greece was more divided into like separate regions, like the area that Athens was in and the area that Sparta was in the south. They'd all have their own law codes. And, they might take similar approaches, but, if you did something in Sparta, the punishment wouldn't necessarily be the same as if you had done it in Athens.
Okay. Is it safe to say that in your opinion, I'm saying opinion because we're saying alleged because we don't know what actually went down. But is
Yeah.
it safe to say that some of these legendary figures in Greek mythology were serial killers? You know, when you think about people like Bacchus or people, and gods like people, gods like Bacchus and the different darker gods.
Well, what is the impression that you're having of Bacchus or Dionysus? Because he's really, he's another figure that maybe like filtered through the media has been represented highly inaccurately these days. Tell me what you're thinking about him.
Well, I'm not saying he killed people. I'm just saying because he was more like I kind of painted myself in a corner here
No,
because
I didn't mean to do that. I was just wondering if you had something specific that he had done.
no. I'm just saying. I'm just talking about the darker gods in Greek history, like we talked about Ares or Athena, or whatever. But some of these darker gods that were representative of bad things.
Yeah, well, I don't think that Bacchus or Dionysus was necessarily representative of anything bad at all. He was really, I mean, Ares for sure. In
Right.
fact, Ares was the least worshipped god. Like in terms of when you think of like Greek temples, like to Zeus or Athena, the Parthenon, the temples to Apollo, beautiful, huge temples. Ares, like people were not building temples to Ares, not a lot of them anyway. They weren't building temples to Hades, the god of the
Underworld.
the underworld. And it's not like he killed anybody. He was just this gloomy god, and people didn't want to like honor him because they didn't want to be like, oh, it's great to be dead or anything. But Hades didn't kill people. There was a lesser god, Thanatos, who was associated. I mean, death. That's actually his name. So they didn't have the same sort of concepts of crime and punishment in the afterlife. I mean, they had degrees of punishments. You can read about people like Sisyphus, rolling the stone up the hill endlessly, or Tantalus being tortured by not being able to reach food or drink. But the concept of punishment in the afterlife was a developing one that changed over the centuries and was, eventually separated into the island of the blessed and the place where people are punished and all of that. But you're not really looking at some fiery brimstone, Judeo-Christian concept there. So in terms of the darker gods, like Dionysus too was really sort of a nature god, like a fertility and nature god. And you could maybe be thinking of something later like the great god Pan, who if you're thinking of like Arthur Macon's short story, The Great God, where definitely Pan is an ominous and dark figure there, was not quite what was going on in the ancient world with Dionysus. It was sort of more like you would commune with Dionysus to get in touch with nature, and free your spirit and reach a different level of consciousness. So there were a bunch of rituals involved there, but we're not talking human sacrifice or anything like that. So the evidence for human sacrifice in ancient Greece is still really debated. I mean, there is some, or maybe not, depending on how you interpret the evidence. Whole books have been written about this. And I'm not going to come down on one side or the other of that argument. There are some descriptions, I think in the ancient epic cycle of Trojan woman Polyxena being sacrificed at the tomb of Achilles, I think, or I'm kind of not remembering the details of that one very well, but it's rare. And then on the other hand, you have these stories of let's leave a sacrifice out once a year for the monster, so the monster won't ravage our town. And then there's the question of, are those monsters based on some sort of, awareness of serial mutilation murders? Oh, it's just a young virgin maiden, like at certain intervals, or oh, it's a young man at certain intervals. But there's certainly there are ritual aspects to modern serial killings, but we don't want to necessarily say that every single story that talks about sacrificing a maiden or a young man at certain intervals was necessarily about serial killing. There are certainly various landmarks that are celebrated, like we celebrate birthdays, anniversaries. They did the same thing. So maybe these are marking the foundation of the town or something. Maybe it's not really a human sacrifice. Maybe it's a fake sacrifice, they pretend they go through some sort of a mime or a play and reenact a foundation myth, and no one's really actually sacrificed. So it's a little hard to sift through all that, and people are, still working on it. Evidence still comes up occasionally. Yeah.
Good. One more last question for you. I asked this to all my business or not clients, but people I do, reporter work for businesses. You're standing on the strip in Las Vegas, and there's a bunch of other historians standing out there too, and they all have books. What do you do to get people to read your book?
Well, why am I in Las Vegas?
Vacation.
Why Las Vegas? I don't think I've ever set foot in Las Vegas, actually, despite having grown up in Southern California. Is there a significance to the Las Vegas part?
Just lots of people walking by, and you're trying to bring people in to read your book.
People walking by. Well, I really like the cover that you have flashed a few times, and I very much appreciate it. But it's again, you asked these terrific questions I don't really have an answer for, because this sort of self-promotion is actually kind of new to me. I mean, I have over the decades given various radio interviews here and there. My first book was on ancient ghost stories, and so I went through something similar there. But what I try to tell people, and I know we're short on time here, is that I'm in the field of classics, which is the study of the ancient Mediterranean world, basically. And we have this reputation of ivory tower academics, blah, blah, blah. But what I'm trying to do is show that that's not the case, that so much of the material is relevant to modern life in ways that you wouldn't even necessarily think of. The haunted house, the chain-rattling ghosts go back 2,000 years. Serial mutilation murder, we have stories about that from 2,000 years ago. So, it's not just like, this refined, let's read ancient epic and it's so lofty. It's like there's like some really relevant things about everyday life that even 2,000 years ago were still going on. And does that help us understand why it's going on now, or how we're characterizing it, or what does it say about the human condition or human nature? So that's not going to convince anybody in Las Vegas to buy my book, but it is kind of what I like to say. We're relevant. We're still relevant. We're not just like reading random, obscure texts.
Right. This hour went by really fast. It was great. I love history. I always have. Humanities was my favorite.
Oh, you asked some terrific questions to really,
I had a ball, and I'd like to get you on again to talk about ancient ghosts.
That would be if you have time closer to Halloween, I would love to.
Yes. Oh, yeah, we can do that.
I've actually got a picture on my wall here, of a ghost.
Well, we'll set that up. I could definitely do that. But thank you so much. How do people reach you?
I have an email. I have a website. Do you want me to put this in the chat, and you can?
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I work at a state school. There's nothing, a large state university. There's nothing secret about getting a hold of me. There's that's my email. There's a website on the UMass Amherst Classics department, has all of our faculty profiles on there. I do a lot with the eerie and the weird. I edit a journal called Preternature, which publishes articles on the weird and the eerie.
Right.
So it's basically my special area within the field.
And how do people get your book?
Oh, it's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble. The publisher, University of Texas Press, has it. If anybody, and it's honestly the paperback version is not expensive. I don't make money off of this, by the way. Yeah, I probably get like 7 cents for every $100 or something. Published. So even though the books are aimed towards a general audience, it's still not the sort of publishing contract that you find by popular authors. It's an academic contract. And, if I wanted money, I'd have gone to law school instead of going into classics.
Gotcha. I understand.
Yeah, so I don't get rich off of this. I just get the word out that there's a lot of interesting things going on in the ancient literature that people don't necessarily know about.
Absolutely great. Well, thank you so much. And like I said, we'll start emailing back and forth and figure out an evening in October closer to Halloween so we can talk about ancient ghosts.
Well, Charlotte, thanks again for having me. It's really been fun talking with you, and you've asked some great questions.
Well, thank you very much for being on. I appreciate it.
It's always the point, yeah.
All right. You have a good one.
Okay, you too. Thanks again.
Okay, bye-bye. Alrighty. You know what was weird, and I don't know if it was an EVP or it was something on her end that came through, but a few minutes ago, a voice definitely came through, and I don't know if it was because we have an air show going on right now, so I don't know if it was an overlap on from a radio station or what, but it was really loud in my headphones. I don't know if you guys heard it. I got to go back and listen to it because I don't know what the heck it was. So, okay, was it your end? Okay, so it wasn't her end. So something came through, and I don't know if it was EVP. This house is actively haunted. So I mean, it could have been something from this end, especially this room. So I'll have to go back and find out what it was. I know it wasn't a neighbor because it was just too clear, too clear. So I'm going to find out. But anyway, thank you for being. I want to thank her for being on again, and thank you guys for coming in. We don't usually do a Sunday show, but it was fun. It was fun to get up on a Sunday and do this. Tomorrow we're changing pace a little bit. We're going to be getting serious and putting my journalist hat on. We're going to be talking about abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse. We're going to be talking about that with Reverend Gene Heil. And he has a technique that he uses to help people get through abusive situations. In fact, he was abused when he was a child. So we're going to be talking with him, and that's going to be our usual time at 6:30 p.m. If you like the show, share it with 5 people. If you didn't like the show, share it with 5 of your enemies. We want to get the word out on this show. We're like I keep telling you guys, we're building up. And since we're nonprofit, this show is done out of pocket, and I'm poor. This show is done out of pocket, so I pay for all the internet and everything, fees on there. And if you feel in your heart that it's a good enough show, we want to keep guests coming, please donate at paypal.me at California Haunts. The other problem we have right now too is our YouTube channel. Oh my gosh, the YouTube channel is crazy because we can't get a dedicated URL to our YouTube channel. So what we have to do is we need at least 100 to 110 people to subscribe to the show, and then we can get a dedicated URL. Otherwise, you're not going to find us on YouTube. Okay, you can search all you want. You can Google blah blah blah. You're not going to find us. The best way to get to our YouTube channel is to go to our website at www.californiahauntsradio.com. Click on a video there. And if you go in there, you'll see a video on the front page, and then you can go up into our archives, and we have everything going back for the last 2 years. And click on one of those videos. That'll take you to YouTube, and then you can subscribe from there. So if you guys could do that, that would be great, because we do want to get a dedicated YouTube URL. Anyway, I want to thank you guys for coming. I will see you tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m., and I got to find out what that crazy voice was. So here we go. Have a good one. I will see you tomorrow.